So, for more than a year now, congressional lawmakers have been conducting an antitrust investigation into four of the largest tech companies. That investigation is coming to a close, and lawmakers are due to hear directly from the CEOs of those four companies. The hearing was actually supposed to happen on Monday, but it may be postponed because Congressman Don Lewis will be lying in state, and so that may sort of shift the schedule a little. But we want to bring in Franklin Foyer to join us to talk a little bit more about this. Franklin, you are a staff writer for The Atlantic, and just to let everyone know, the four companies are Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google. Four completely different companies: a social media site, a search engine, a company that delivers anything you want to your front door in a matter of hours, and then there's Apple that makes you sort of both hardware and software. Very different companies, but behemoths in their area. What have lawmakers been looking into?
Right. So these companies have just achieved this omnipresent role in our lives, in our democracy, in our economy. We've invited them very deeply into our existence. We carry them in our pockets all the time. We stick them, the little discs that they offer, in our bedrooms, in our kitchens. We consume nearly everything, from some of these companies. And the question is have they become too powerful? Do they leverage their position? Because they sit kind of atop various sectors of the economy, in the way that Amazon sits across retail, the way that Google and Facebook sit across advertising, that there are these choke points in access to information, choke points in access to apps or to news. And so the question is, have they been abusive with this position, this dominant position that they have, that their platforms permit them? And so there has been investigation where they've been digging up emails. They've been doing a lot that's happened kind of behind closed doors. And so we come to this culminating moment where the CEOs of these tech companies, some of whom have never really been hauled before Congress before, are suddenly going to be asked very difficult questions. And the power of tech is actually one of the few areas where we have some measure of bipartisan agreement in our politics.
Yeah, except Franklin, we see this time and time and again. Tech CEOs, just like Wall Street CEOs, get called up to the Hill to testify. Lawmakers pontificate for the cameras for a couple of hours, and they scream at them and they point their fingers, and then these guys go back to their private jets and their billion-dollar lives, and we never see anything really significant coming out of this. At least not something that is on the surface what people can readily understand. There might be minute changes that happen behind the scenes. So what are the possible outcomes that we could potentially see because of this congressional probe?
Right. Well, I think there are two things. One is that this could be prelude to a different administration that comes in a couple months that has a different attitude towards antitrust and competition. And within the Democratic Party in particular, but also, like I said, it's bipartisan, there is pressure to move against these companies. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be busted into pieces, but there could be much more serious investigations and penalties levied against these companies because of their privacy practices, because of their competition behavior. But the other thing that I'd like to point to is that the last time a company faced this kind of pressure was Microsoft in the late 1990s. The government sued Microsoft for its anti-competitive behavior. And you could look at that and you say, well, what did that really accomplish? Because Microsoft survived that antitrust suit. But really, its behavior modified in response to all of the negative exposure, all the government attention, the worry that government might actually split Microsoft into pieces. And so you have the development of the web browser, and Google could very easily have been strangled in its crib by Microsoft. But because Microsoft was so worried about government coming after it, it allowed space for Google to thrive. And so I think that's the ultimate goal, is that we need to have these companies feel some sense of pressure, some sense that there's going to be a government looking at them and its practices, so that they permit other forces in the economy and society to emerge, and they don't strangle them by using their dominance.
And of course, like everything in life over the last 6 months, this pandemic has sort of brought all of this to a crescendo. We're even more dependent on a lot of these platforms than we ever were before. We're not going out shopping. We're getting things delivered. Many of us can't, we're depending on Google to do work. A lot of people depend on Facebook to get all their information about COVID and everything else. And so I think it's just such an interesting discussion, because I know some of these platforms have sort of argued that they're so much a part of our lives that they're kind of elevated to the point of being a utility. But with utilities come certain amounts of responsibilities, like the utilities here, whether it's your heat, they're not going to turn your heat off in the wintertime. There's an obligation not to put people at risk, and it almost feels like these platforms are kind of wanting all the good things that come with being a utility, but none of the responsibilities that go with it as well.
Yeah, yeah, right. They want the power and none of the responsibility, and we see this in a lot of the debates over the public square. And so, if you're a company like Google, or, in the question of kind of, they argue kind of whatever goes on YouTube is not our legal responsibility. In fact, they have legal immunity from that. But the rest of the world is saying, look, the system that you've created, Google and Facebook or Twitter, is so toxic, and we want there to be some sort of rules on it. We want there to be somebody governing the system. Why is it that the internet economy is devoid of so many of the same rules that we see imposed in the analog, the old economy? And so, so this is one question I think that's going to frame the debate going forward. So either they can maintain their power, and they're going to have to be governed like a utility, and they're going to be regulated, and they're going to have the government looking over them to make sure that they behave correctly when it comes to using their users' data, when it comes to adhering to some sort of public spiritedness, or the companies are going to be broken up into much smaller pieces. And a lot of this is really simple to do. Like, you look at something like Facebook. Why does Facebook need to own WhatsApp and Instagram? Unwinding those entities, I don't think would really hurt the public in any sort of meaningful sort of way, and would be incredibly easy to do, and would diminish Facebook's power overnight. And so I think that the government is going to start looking at both of those options.
It's so fascinating, and I love the point that you made earlier about Microsoft and how it had to moderate its behavior, but it still, Franklin, makes me think of things like the mafia, right? I mean, a lot of people think the mafia went away after they arrested, John Gotti, and he passed on, and all these guys went to jail, and we know that that's not true. They've moderated their behavior. They're perhaps not as front and center as they used to be, but they're still out there, and it's the same thing with, I think, these companies. You mentioned again that they are worried that they may be regulated in some capacity. And here's the one concern that I think a lot of people have. It's privacy issues. You write in your work in The Atlantic that the pandemic could have these long-ranging implications for American citizens when it comes to our privacy. Can you explain a little bit of that?
Right. So, I mean, when you look at the pandemic, as you mentioned earlier, our life has become totally mediated by technology. Our kids go to school on their screens. We interact with the rest of the world via our screens in a much more substantial way than before. And that means that the people who control our screens come to have greater control over our lives. And we see this with employees, right? So work is this thing. There used to be this kind of very firm boundary separating our work life from our home life, but now they're kind of one in the same. And so if you're an employer, there are all sorts of technologies and applications that they have to be able to monitor if we're still being productive on our computers, which exist in our home. And so the surveillance capacities of these companies is immense. It's growing even more immense as they get involved in contact tracing, as they step in and they say, look, the government is dealing with all these complicated issues with schooling, and we can step in and we know how to do these things better than the government does. So you should probably just hand us more responsibility. And again, it all goes back to this ultimate question. If these companies are going to keep acquiring ever greater responsibilities for very precious things like our privacy, our data, our consumption of news, of what's true and what's not true, how our kids entertain themselves, then they're going to have to answer to the public in some sort of way, shape, or form. And maybe they're not going to disappear. Maybe their power is something that the American system is not equipped to deal with. I happen to think that it is. And I think that it's, like I said, I think it's possible to break up these companies. And that's an idea that kind of sat way out on the margins maybe a year or 2 or 3 ago, but that's going to be drifting much closer to the center of the debate. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the primary proposals that the House subcommittee ends up pushing.
This is not the first time that these tech companies have been sort of caught in the crosshairs when it comes to congressional hearings or even, hearings overseas. And it always strikes me that, every once in a while you get a CEO to sit down in front of one of these panels and they're expecting to get all of the CEOs to sit down. And they're, often very contrite and, they and kind of talk about the altruistic motivations for, why they even developed the company and all that sort of stuff. But then, 2 days later, you hear how they've gobbled up another company, or Twitter is working with law enforcement, or they're making cars, or it's like these companies, it's like the CEOs, it's sort of like a bit of a dog and pony show. And so I'm wondering, what the lawmakers think they're even getting out of having the actual CEO sit in front of them.
And can I just add, Emery, to that before, Franklin, you answer? Yeah. Let me just add to that. The other thing, and Emery, you and I have talked about this, is watching sometimes these septuagenarians try to say, as they look down at their notes and say, so with the Twitters out there, are we worried about the Twitters are going to, ruin our elections? It sometimes feels as if they don't even understand the questions. Exactly. Yeah. They're going to consignment sell on eBay.
All right. In the defense of the old doddering questioners in these hearings, I actually think that Mark Zuckerberg's appearance on the Hill, well, I think it was I can't remember, 2018, was actually an important moment. And you look at kind of how Facebook's fate since the Zuckerberg hearings. It's not like, Facebook continues to be an extremely profitable company. So there's no denying that. But you look at the political context in which they exist, and you look in the business context in which they exist, where you have major companies like Disney boycotting Facebook. And now, is there a connection in this long continuum? I would argue that there is, that when you have politicians saying Facebook's behavior is reprehensible, it creates the conditions for the Disney CEO or the North Face CEO or whoever to be able to say, look, we agreed Facebook's behavior is reprehensible and we're not going to spend our money there. And then when you start to get into that level of discussion where you have businesses saying we're going to boycott this platform and we're going to deprive them of their primary source of revenue, then the discussion starts to change. And Mark Zuckerberg, as you've seen more recently, he's so difficult to nudge. He's like the most stubborn guy because he idealistically believes in the good of what he's doing. But you can see that they've started to take a different position on political ads coming in the 2020 election. And so it's a long game that we're talking about. And these companies and the political dynamic and their behavior needs to be changed over a long period of time. And these events may look stupid in the moment. Although I've got a hunch that this one will be better just because David Cicilline and the investigators there have done such hard work. But we have to look at it as a long narrative. And you go back just a couple years ago and how glossy the image of these companies was. Like there was Mark Zuckerberg. He was the most admired man in America. Everybody wanted their kid to grow up to be Mark Zuckerberg. Now, a lot of parents, they want their kids to be as rich as Mark Zuckerberg, but I don't think that they think of Mark Zuckerberg as a paragon of moral goodness anymore.
Franklin Foer, what a fascinating discussion. Love your work at The Atlantic. Loved your first book, How Soccer Explains the World. Thanks for coming on and sharing your thoughts with us. It was really, really good. Yeah, interesting stuff.
Pleasure.